In this video, we're going to look at the consonant T and all of the many sounds it represents in American English, some of which are quite difficult for English learners to make. But fear not, by the end of this video, you'll be able to say them all like a native. However, in order to do this right, we're going to have to learn to look at English words phonetically, because English spelling is too confusing and deceptive. We're going to use two kinds of transcription. First, we'll use a broad transcription between slashes that'll show all the basic sounds in the word. Then we'll use a narrow transcription between brackets to show the actual pronunciation after all the phonetic changes have taken place. In other words, the narrow transcription represents the actual spoken word, what we actually say. For instance, this is Betty. If we look at the basic sounds in her name, we get Betty. But in order to pronounce this word correctly and idiomatically in American English, we have to observe certain rules and make some phonetic changes. In British English, the broad transcription Betty would be no different from the actual spoken word, Betty. However, American English doesn't work the same way. In American English, when T comes between two vowels and is the first sound in an unstressed syllable, we pronounce it as the so-called flap, which is normally represented in the IPA as this symbol. Personally, I find this symbol is hard to distinguish from regular R and not very easy to read, especially in small print, so I use a different symbol in my transcriptions, this one. We use this sound constantly in American English, so it's a good idea to learn to say it properly. Just use the tip of your tongue and tap the ridge behind your front top teeth. Autumn, autumn, autumn. If you're lucky enough to be coming from a language like Russian, Italian, or Spanish that pronounce R as a flap, then you'll have no problem pronouncing R, because it's basically the same sound. For instance, in all these languages, the name Sarah is pronounced Sara, using my transcription. Sara, Sara, Sara. The American English pronunciation of Betty uses the same sound. Listen to them side by side. Sara, Betty, Sara, Betty, Sara, Betty. In both cases, it's just a tap with the tip of the tongue. Betty lives in the city. We do the same thing with city. Phonetically, it's city, but again, the T is between two vowels, I and E, and the syllable T is unstressed, so we say city, city, city. Now let's look at one more example. Betty lives in the city of Seattle. Because of the way it's spelled, Seattle might confuse you a little. We have to look at it phonetically because the spelling is intimidating. In the broad transcription, we see Seattle. In English, L can act as a vowel sometimes. When it does, I use this symbol. So because L is considered a vowel and the syllable tl is unstressed, we pronounce the T as R and say rl, rl, Seattle, Seattle. Betty lives in the city of Seattle. Betty lives in the city of Seattle.
City of Seattle. City of Seattle.
Seattle! Seattle!
Seattle, Seattle.
This change of T to the flap doesn't only happen inside words. We also do it when one word ends in T and the next word starts with a vowel sound. For instance, Betty's pretty, but a bit intimidating. Betty's pretty, but a bit intimidating. This sentence has a lot of flaps. By now, you should know why Betty and pretty have flap T. But note that I said, but a bit intimidating. But a bit intimidating. Betty's pretty, but a bit intimidating. Betty's pretty, but a bit intimidating. And why is she intimidating? Because she has a ton of tattoos. A ton of tattoos. This brings us to our second rule. When T is the first letter in any word, it's pronounced with a strong puff of breath. This is called aspiration, and the symbol for it is a small raised H. T, t, t. Ton, ton, ton. And not only at the beginning of words, but also at the beginning of stressed syllables. That's why tattoo has two aspirated T's. The first one because T is the first sound in the word, and the second one because T is the first sound in the stressed syllable to, tattoo, tattoo. A ton of tattoos, a ton of tattoos. She has a ton of tattoos. She has a ton of tattoos.
Tattoos, tattoos.
So where were we? Right. Betty's a bit intimidating because she has a ton of tattoos. But don't let that fool you. She's a total sweetheart. Here we see how T is pronounced at the end of a word or syllable when it's followed by another consonant. We actually put our tongue in the position for T, but we don't release it. We use this symbol. And note that words that end in unreleased T are very clipped and short. Listen again. But don't let that fool you. Notice that each of these words ends very abruptly. That's because when a word ends in unreleased T, we also kind of cut off our breath. Native speakers can do this in very quick succession. But don't let that fool you. But don't let that fool you. You may need to practice this slowly at first and build up to a more natural speed. But don't let that fool you. But don't let that fool you. But don't let that fool you. We hear it twice in the word sweetheart. Once at the end of the syllable sweet, and again at the end of the word heart. Sweetheart. Sweetheart. And of course, total has aspirated T at the beginning and flap T in the middle. Total. Total. Total sweetheart. Total sweetheart. Here we see that unreleased T is also used at the end of a word when there's no other word behind it. For example, when you're reading words in isolation, like wait, what? Listen to how abruptly these actors say the words don't let that.
Don't let that stop you.
Don't let that go to your head.
As you can hear in these examples, there's a little pause after unreleased T. Don't let that. Don't let that. Don't let that fool you. This morning, Betty came to my job to tell me that she had to find a new place to live. I want you to pay special attention to how I pronounce the word to here. Listen again. This morning, Betty came to my job to tell me that she had to find a new place to live. When the word to comes after a word ending in a voiced sound, it's commonly pronounced with d instead of t. Also note that when it's unstressed, it's usually pronounced with instead of oo. We say ta or duh, not to or do. Came to my job. Came to my job. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with saying came to my job here. It's just that a lot of people will say duh, and you should learn to listen out for it and know that you can use it yourself to sound more natural.
I came to my first dance in this town.
When you came to my hotel, he had roughed you up.
My job to tell me. Came to my job to tell me. Job to. Again, b is a voiced sound, so we tend to say job to. Job to. Came to my job to tell me.
I've got a job to do.
Now you got a job to do.
Had to find. Again, we hear it in had to. Had to. Be sure to say both D's distinctly. Don't release the first one, just hold it. Then release the second one. Had. But
I had to be certain.
You had to do it, didn't you?
But we don't say duh after place because S is a voiceless sound. So we say another place to live. Place to live. So now that you're familiar with all these sounds, let's look at Betty's story again, but this time as a shadowing exercise. First, I'll say each sentence twice, and then we'll read through the entire story together. Be sure to imitate my sounds, my intonation, and my rhythm. Ready? Let's go. This is Betty. This is Betty. Betty lives in the city of Seattle. Betty lives in the city of Seattle. Betty's pretty, but a bit intimidating because she has a ton of tattoos. Betty's pretty, but a bit intimidating because she has a ton of tattoos. But don't let that fool you. She's a total sweetheart. But don't let that fool you. She's a total sweetheart. This morning, Betty came to my job to tell me that she had to find a new place to live. This morning, Betty came to my job to tell me that she had to find a new place to live. Now let's read the entire story together. This is Betty. Betty lives in the city of Seattle. Betty's pretty, but a bit intimidating because she has a ton of tattoos. But don't let that fool you. She's a total sweetheart. This morning, Betty came to my job to tell me that she had to find a new place to live. As always, thank you for watching this video, and don't forget to give it a like and subscribe for more content like this.